Okay, so I'm going to be honest. I don't have the extensive behind-the-scenes knowledge of the history of the Rocky franchise as I do with some of the other franchises that I've covered here. There just doesn't seem to be that much out there in terms of what decisions were made and why this happened, as I did with, say, the Star Trek series or even the Planet of the Apes. I know a lot about the background of the Planet of the Apes movies, but with the Rocky films, there's just not a whole lot out there that I've found. Because the question that immediately springs to mind when you see Rocky 2 is, whose decision was this? Who decided they wanted to do another Rocky film? Was this a desire of the creator vis-a-vis Sly Stallone? You know, was this him wanting to continue the story? He had more, you know, as he'll say later, I got more in the basement. You know, he's got more story to tell. Kind of a George Lucas situation. Or was this a mandate of the studio? I mean, Rocky was a massive success, not just in terms of financially, but pop culturally. It became an icon. It won Oscars. It won the Oscar. It won Best Picture. So you could see it from their point of view, a studio head point of view, of wanting to capitalize on that success. So is this like a Planet of the Apes situation where they said, this thing is huge, we got to do another one, we got to jump on this, something that's going to make us more money, and the rest of the crew had to kind of come along for the ride? I don't really have an answer for that. The best I could find that me and my team could uncover was that, yeah, this was pretty much the producer's idea, and Sly Stallone was very willing to go along with it, provided that he was allowed to direct. And apparently he had to really campaign for that directing job before they finally gave in and let him do it. Almost as much as he had to campaign to actually let them, for them to let him play Rocky originally. We didn't really cover that in the first review, is that he really had to campaign to let them play the lead in his own movie. Regardless, everything worked out. And what we have, and why this conversation is important, why I want to lead with this, is because now, going forward, for the foreseeable future, and only until Rocky 5, from now on, the Rocky franchise is going to have one creative voice, one vision that is being translated. Because you have the same guy writing the movies, directing the movies, and starring in the movies. So the big three of making a movie is all one person. And this is going to be the trend for the majority of the Rocky franchise going forward. We are going to see that this is the creator's vision. Now, it's debatable how much creative control he'll have going into each film, but the fact of the matter is, this is the brainchild of one creative talent. And that's something that's going to be important to remember as we kind of move forward into the Rocky franchise. So let's talk about Rocky 2, and how do you do a sequel to such an iconic film? Well, the basics is, you basically, you know, in the shorthand, without looking at the details of it, is you basically make the same movie. You know, Rocky and Apollo Creed, of course, must have a rematch, and this time Rocky must come out victorious. So that's the shorthand, you know, but as any creative person will tell you, the devil's in the details. You know, there's only I forget what the book says, like 14 or something different plots out there, and it's just how you tell them that makes them different. And what we'll find with the Rocky franchise in this entrance in particular is that, yeah, they may be formulaic, and they're going to get more formulaic as they go forward, but they change the details, and that's what keeps people coming back. So let's talk about the details of the plot of Rocky 2. So this film is a direct continuation to the original, picks up right where the original left off, after like literally right where the original left off, like immediately after the fight. So Rocky's pretty beaten up, he's pretty injured. He makes the decision he's gonna retire. Apollo Creed is shouting he wants a rematch. At first mainly for just the publicity of it, and then honestly wanting a rematch. Rocky says, no, I'm done, I'm retired. He already has more money from this fight than he's ever had in his life. He has people wanting to give him endorsement deals. He and Adrian are getting married. So, things look like they're going pretty well for Rock for a while. And then, as usually happens in the Rocky films, reality kind of rears its head. He finds that money that he made from that one fight that he's spending very, very, loosely, is not going to last forever, and he is going to need more income eventually after he's bought a car and jewelry and a house and all of this. And he's also going to find that the job market is not exactly open to a guy who doesn't have a high school education and whose only marketable skill was getting punched in the face a whole lot. And coupled with this, the constant taunting from Apollo Creed, people start calling him a chicken and all of this. And eventually it lures him back into the ring, much to the chagrin of Adrian. So those are the details. So let's talk about some very interesting things that I noticed watching this movie. First of all, I think this is a great continuation. And in terms of direct sequels, I think they don't get a lot better than Rocky 2, because I don't know if he had this idea originally. Again, I don't know if this was like you always hear George Lucas says with the original Star Wars trilogy and even the prequels, so no one believes him, that he had the whole story figured out and then had to chop it up into, smaller increments. So I don't know if Sylvester Stallone had this idea already for a sequel, or if it was something he came up with when the deal was finalized. Either way, it's a great pickup. And it deals with things that even today, a lot of athletes have to deal with once their playing days are over. That concept of, you see this a lot with, these kids who get drafted right into the NFL or right into the NBA, and they're in their early 20s or not even in some cases. And suddenly these kids who never had a lot of money, or any money in some cases, are now suddenly given multi-million dollar contracts. And you see them, they go out, they buy houses, they buy 27 cars, they do all this because of course they did. If you suddenly said, Brandon, we're going to give you $20 million to review movies, you better believe that I'm going to go out and buy some crazy shit. When I got my job, and I had a steady income, yeah, I went crazy buying stuff because I had money. But what a lot of them run into is that problem of that money runs out eventually. And what you also see a lot of them have issues with is a lot of them don't finish college, and a lot of them, the ones that do, sometimes the degree is almost useless because they've been allowed to kind of skate through. In most cases, not all. And so only a few of them get the lucrative announcement jobs, the play-by-play guys, or, the correspondent on ESPN or NFL Network or whatever. So the question then becomes, what do these guys do? How do they, what do you do with the rest of your life when your career ends at 40? And I think this film does a great job using that as the background and giving Rocky a different motivation, a motivation we can still understand as an audience, and that is still consistent with his character, for why he'd get back in the ring and go do, the same thing again. Also, what's very interesting is I think in this film, we get more from Apollo Creed. Now, anybody who knows these movies knows that Apollo Creed is going to become one of the most important fixtures. He is to the Rocky franchise as Robin is to Batman. He is just as important that necessary character. Even after his character dies, he is still one of the most important characters in the franchise. And I think Sylvester Stallone knew enough that if you're going to do the sequel and you're going to have Apollo Creed back as the antagonist, you've got to give him a little bit more depth as well. You've got to understand why he would want this fight. Why would he want this fight? Why would he want to go again? He won. He's still the champion. And what they do very well is, show... They don't give him a lot of screen time, but in the screen time he has, they show the hate mail he's getting. They show they never come out and say it, but they show the difficulty of him being a black man in America, a successful black man in America at that time, and the pressures that puts on him socially, culturally, and again, it's not a lot of screen time, so it's a big endorsement of Carl Weathers as an actor, that even with the little bit of screen time he's given, and Sly Stallone as a writer, even with the little bit of screen time he gives Apollo, that they establish a character motivation like that. One thing we're going to find, and one of the running jokes of the Rocky franchise as it moves deeper and deeper, is that Adrian kind of falls into a rut. Again, the Rocky films are going to become formulaic, but the joke always being that Adrian falls into kind of the same, "You're never gonna win, Rock! Don't do it, Rock!" She becomes basically this shrill harpy. That's the joke. Whether she does or not, we can discuss. But what I like is that if you watch this film, you understand where that is coming from, especially as it goes into later movies. You gotta remember, it has got to be hard to be the spouse of a professional athlete. It's got to be even harder to be the spouse of a professional athlete in any kind of contact sport. And it's got to be even harder to be the spouse of an athlete in something like boxing, MMA, UFC, or even professional wrestling. This is a sport where the athlete is required to endure physical punishment, to be kicked and punched and beaten up, and to have to watch that happen to the person you love is incredibly difficult, especially when it seems like they're always getting beaten up worse and worse and worse as it goes on. So I think he gives Adrian a nice bit of growth here, in that she loves him and she wants to support him, but when he wants to go back to fighting, why she is so resistant to it. And it also shows the reaction that has on Rocky. He wants to fight, but at the same time, he doesn't like disappointing his wife. He doesn't like that he went back on his word, and how that has a negative effect on him going into the fight. Now, this brings us to a very interesting thing that I noticed in terms of this movie specifically, and it'll be interesting to see how this follows through as we move into the 80s with the Rocky franchise. One thing I've discovered, and I think it's pretty universal knowledge, doing Forgotten Gems during this quarantine period, is, the different mindsets of different decades and times, and how those mindsets, those, those values from different time periods can seem very alien and very odd to us when viewed through a modern context. And this can be everything. I mentioned this doing like the Maisie and Torchy Blaine reviews, is that the downright disgusting, racial things in old movies is shocking. That we ever thought that was okay. And sometimes it's smaller things, just, the perception of genders or perception of race. How those things translate can sometimes date a movie. And one of the things I noticed watching this movie the other day is how silently progressive Rocky is as a character, and how well the character of Rocky holds up under scrutiny, at least my scrutiny, in terms of things that we look at today when we critique art or movies or whatever, especially when it relates to the concept that's come into prominence over the last couple of years, the concept of toxic masculinity. Now, for those who don't know, you may have heard the term, and they're kind of immediately are put off by it, and I can respect that. But what is toxic masculinity, just for the understanding of this review? Well, I looked it up, and the basic definition is toxic masculinity relates to a set of attitudes and ways of behaving stereotypically associated or expected of men, and that these attitudes have a negative impact on men and society as a whole. Now, that is the definition of toxic masculinity. So what that means is the attitudes that are usually associated with being male, the concept of physical strength is the most important thing. You never show emotion. The male has to be the dominant personality in any relationship. Things of that nature would be considered toxic masculinity, things that we are shown in media, that we're taught. Some are taught as young men. I was never taught that. And how that will have a negative impact on us as males and society in general. Now, I'm not a big fan of the term toxic masculinity. I've been told that makes me ignorant. But I agree with the concept. And the reason I bring this up is because as I'm watching this movie recently, it's amazing to me, especially when you consider the time period in which it was made, 41 years ago as of this recording, and the type of person Rocky is, his cultural background, that Rocky is a perfect example of the exact opposite of toxic masculinity, which is amazing when you consider that his profession is boxing, supposedly the most macho of macho sports. But Rocky himself and his motivations for things are, fly in the face of toxic masculinity, and that is really shown here in this film. One thing you see throughout the entire series, but in these two films especially, how deeply in love he is with Adrian, and how there is never, throughout the entire series, there is never another woman. There's never someone who turns his head or he thinks about for a second. No. Adrian is his life, and he is not afraid to show her affection. He's not abusive to her. He never strong-arms her. He never threatens her. Now you compare this to Paulie, who is a, mountain of toxic masculinity. His greatest, dream in life is to be an enforcer for a loan shark. Compare that to the abuse of Paulie. Rocky, while he is not happy that a pregnant Adrian has to go and get her job back at the pep store to help them make ends meet, and it does make him feel like he's failed her, he never says to her, no, you're not gonna do that. You know what? No wife of mine is gonna, work. He lets her, he accepts it. It's not that he lets her work, he accepts it, and, accepts that it's a partnership. He plays with kids. He openly weeps when Adrian is in the hospital and is sick. He shows complete love and dedication to his wife and child. The reason he goes back to fighting is to provide for them. And even in terms, even with the boxing element of it, at least in these two films, what's interesting is that his motivation for doing it is not this desire to beat the guy and to show that he's the manliest and the strongest and the meanest. Grr. It's, to prove that he's not a bum, or to provide a living for his family, that this is what he does, this is what he's good at, and this is what he can do to provide for his family. So all of this, now take into consideration two things. One, this is in the 70s, 1979, so again, 41 years ago. And to have that kind of character as the, focal point of your movie, that's, again, silently revolutionary. The 70s, men in the 70s and 70s movies, this was the era of the tough guy, the Steve McQueens, the Shafts, the badasses. And it's going to get even worse as we get into the 80s, when this stuff, toxic masculinity is the order of the day. And to have a character like Rocky who flies in the face of all of that, that's pretty amazing. Also consider that he is Italian. Not just Italian, but old school, East Coast Italian. And it's amazing how perfectly he encapsulates that nationality and that kind of subculture. Here's an example. I'm not saying all, but I know I had a great uncle, old school Italian, and he was pretty freaking racist. He said some things that'll curl your hair, and given how curly my hair is already, you can imagine. And older Italian men, not all of them, neither one of my grandfathers ever were, but I know of others who did have a hard time with African Americans and the black culture, but Rocky, that is never an issue for him. He respects Apollo Creed from the word go. He becomes friends with Apollo Creed, and later in the series we'll see that he takes in Adonis Creed without any kind of, reservations towards it. So again, especially in that time period, the 70s, when racial issues were kind of at their peak, or so we thought, to have a character who is that open to the African American characters, it's again, silently revolutionary. Nothing that puts the soapbox down and has you get up on it and just go, oh, but little tiny things that, when taken as a whole, I think go a long way to explaining why these films and why this character has resonated for so long, and why he resonates with so many, why he's crossed, gender lines and racial lines. And I think it's this very quiet, subtle things that Sly Stallone did with the writing and the directing and the acting that made him that freaking relatable. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see if this trend continues as Rocky enters the 80s. And, we start getting a little bit more of that macho man kind of attitude, as we'd see in a lot of 80s films from his buddy Arnold Schwarzenegger. But at least as of right now in these two movies, I think this goes a long way to describing why Rocky is so beloved and why his fandom has extended for 40 plus years. I mean, that's a lot. The last thing to really touch on is, as I said at the very beginning, is that so from here on out, with only one exception within the standard Rocky franchise, and then when we start into the Creed franchise, the Rocky movies now have one directorial and creative voice, and that is Sylvester Stallone's. And what really strikes me is that I think Sylvester Stallone is a very good director. And what's interesting is that he really didn't direct a lot outside of the Rocky films. I know a lot of his films that he didn't direct within the Rocky series bombed, but still, the Rocky series show a very clean and crisp directorial style. Now, you compare this film to the original Rocky, and we didn't talk too much about the director, John G. Avildsen, in the original Rocky review, but we talked about the eye he had for it, and John G. Avildsen was a very good director and a very notable director. If you don't know some of his other films, I'll just sum it up here. He did all 3 of the Karate Kid movies. So that gives you an idea of just how good this guy was. But, looking at the film, something you notice is that John G. Avildsen was a lot more gritty, a lot more realistic, a lot more, again, very of the the mid-70s in his directorial style. Sly Stallone is a lot more smooth. He likes things to look polished. This film doesn't look as gritty as the original because, when his life is kind of on the skids, it still has that gritty feel to it. But things like the final boxing match are much more showy, much more choreographed, a lot more use of slow motion and close-ups, whereas you don't get that a lot in the original. The colors are a lot more vibrant. In the first one, he's wearing, to the ring, he's wearing this kind of beat up old red robe, with the meatpacking plant that he's fighting at, kind of having a logo on the back. And in this one, it's a very bright gold and black. So with this film, we're slowly transitioning, very subtly transitioning out of the uber realism of the Rocky franchise into a bit more brightly colored, much more spectacle-oriented directing. That's not a bad thing. But it is a distinct contrast between the two primary directors of the Rocky franchise, and especially, again, given that Rocky is now about to go into the 80s, where that kind of directing is the word of the day. I think it bears noting. So, with that in mind, and with that little tidbit in the back of our heads, we now turn our eyes towards the 80s. So Rocky has won the title. He is the world champion. He has redeemed himself. But the question we now ask is, what happens when the champ loses the eye of the tiger? And can he get that eye of the tiger back? And that is something we will explore a little later on when we check out Rocky 3. So, until then, as always, drive safe, and I'll see you at the movies. And yo, Adrian, I reviewed it.